Welcome to College Knowledge, Learning Allies podcast for college students who are blind or visually impaired. This show brings together the three core elements of Learning Allies College Success Program: mentors, resources, and community. I am your co-host, Rachel Greider, blind mentor, music teacher, performer, and lifelong advocate. And speaking of advocacy, that's exactly what we are going to be talking about today. Last year, based on the feedback from mentors, the College Success Program added a course to the curriculum called Living on Your Own. I was really excited to write some resources for this course. For instance, I wrote a resource about shopping on your own, but I also wanted to write a resource about advocacy. I wanted to show that when it comes to advocacy, we've all been there. We've all most likely gotten it wrong a few times. Well, we're all human. And we also want to make advocacy easier for people. I also wanted to show that advocacy happens all the time. You usually don't get a break from it. It can happen in your classes, in job interviews, with friends and family, in restaurants, and in recreational activities. So unfortunately, or fortunately, you always need to be prepared. Here to join me in our advocacy chat are my co-hosts, Rashad Jones and Brian Duarte. To get us started, Brian is going to discuss advocacy in a professional and educational setting, as well as appropriate and effective strategies for both situations.
Thank you, Rachel, for that great introduction. And yes, advocacy is something that is very, very important to me. And I'm a big advocate of self-advocacy. I believe that in a lot of situations, there are right ways and wrong ways to advocate, and you're not always just advocating for yourself. In a lot of ways, especially in the social aspect of things, you are really under a microscope. So the way that you interact with people in a professional or educational setting really could have repercussions on other individuals who are blind or low vision. If you have a good interaction, it could reflect good on the next person they interact with. So it's very important that when you are advocating to not just stomp your feet and storm out or start banging things. So let's look at this from a scenario kind of perspective. When I was a undergraduate, I had a really rough time. I think I've talked about this before, where I had a rough time. My first semester was almost my last semester because of the time that I had, and I expected things to be in place, and things really were not in place to the standard that I thought they should have been. And I had a couple meetings and things did not go well, and I had a decision to make then. I was meeting with the dean, I was meeting with the director of the disability center, as well as my disability advisor. And I think my professor, one of my professors, may have been included in this meeting. And I had to really think about it, how I present myself and my problem and my issues in this meeting could really help me or they could hinder me. So I really thought long and hard about it. I took time. I wrote down the points that I wanted to make, the things that I felt like I needed or wanted and wasn't being given. And I directed my energy into that so that when I came time to be in this meeting with these very, very important people, that I didn't make a fool out of myself, first of all, but also that I was getting things in place for myself and those to follow behind me. So during the meeting, I directed most of my attention to my disabilities advisor. Most of my conversation was almost directly to her at the time, because I wanted to let them know that I respected her as my first in command, so to speak. I didn't try to go over her head by directing it directly to the dean or directly to her supervisor, the disabilities advising supervisor. I went straight to her and to my professor, because I wanted them both to know that I respected their authority and their position. The next thing I did really was I outlined, like I said, I outlined the things that I felt like I needed to be successful in the course. as well as the things that I didn't feel like I was getting or that weren't adequate for me as a blind student. So that was very important. And I want to emphasize the fact that going into a meeting like this with a game plan is probably the most important thing that you can do for yourself, because it's very easy when you have what feels like your back is against the wall. I was on one side of the table, all 5 of them were on the other side of the table. You can really feel like everybody's against you, but if you go in prepared, it really reshapes your mindset in something like this. And it tries to help you from being put into a corner and having nothing to stand on. And then what happens? Your emotions come out, and then you start yelling or crying or demanding, and that's not really effective or appropriate in this situation. So finally, to conclude the meeting, I had this in my notes, by the way, was to lay out next steps. Who was going to do what? How was it going to be done? Was the professor going to be responsible for getting the accessible content, or was the disability center going to be responsible? Was more money needed? Now this gets directed to the dean and to the disabilities advising supervisor. Was there more resources that were needed? Was it something that we needed to brainstorm together? All of these things were strategies that now we came together amongst the people at the table. We came together to outline the next steps and the strategies that we were going to use. At the end of the meeting, things went well. We had a plan in place. We were holding each other accountable. They were checking in with me. And the next 4 years, I guess, were history. I was able to not only be successful in that class, but the classes to come, and I developed great working relationships, and I helped others. So I think that the important thing to take away from this is to make sure that you plan ahead. Don't let your emotions get in the way, and really make sure that when you are talking to them, you're not just advocating for yourself. You really are advocating for yourself, but you're maybe teaching those. Maybe you are the first person who is blind that they are interacting with, but there definitely will be more to follow behind you, and you want to make sure that you don't leave a bitter taste in their mouth because interacting with you was not pleasant. So that concludes kind of my piece on interacting in a professional and educational setting. But what we are going to do now is bring Rachel back on, and she is going to go over advocacy in a public setting. So Rachel?
All right. Thank you, Brian. Great examples there. So there are so many times when we have to go out into the community to do various things, whether we're going out to eat at a restaurant or just walking down the street, or if we're volunteering our services in some capacity, going to a store, going shopping, going to the movies, going anywhere, really. And you may not think of it this way, but advocacy, you have to advocate for yourself, even in settings like that. So, for example, I'll give you an example of a time this has happened to me a couple times. I was walking down the street one time, just minding my own business, in a busy city street, and I was about to cross, and someone came up behind me and grabbed my arm and said, "I will help you across the street." And there was no introduction or anything. He just random person, and so I could have chosen various ways to react to this intrusion. I could have pulled away and said no and been very rude about it. I could have elbowed him in the ribs and said, "Get away from me," or I could have said politely but firmly, "No, thank you. I am I know how to cross the street independently, but thank you for your help." I also could have just accepted his help and meekly gone along with him. So I chose to do the third option. I pulled away and politely, firmly, but I said, "Thank you for your help, but I can cross the street independently." And I proceeded to. He asked me how I was able to do that, And I told him how I could cross the street by listening to my parallel traffic. And so it was a really nice, actually a really good conversation, because I was able to educate this person on how a blind person can cross a street. And I think it's very important, just as Brian said, that we, in order to really have a good impression on people, because we are representing the blind community by the way we react to these types of things. And yes, there are times, when we may need to be more firm than others, and sometimes we don't necessarily have time to stop and give a lesson on how a blind person is able to do things, but it does happen, and it can be a great opportunity for us to share our insights and to educate people, so that the next blind person that comes along, that person will know better how to help them. Another thing that I told this particular person, after I had explained to him how a blind person crosses the street, I said, there you may come across a blind person that needs help sometime, and when you do that, this is the appropriate way to address it. You ask them if they need help and how you can best help them, and that would be more appropriate than going up and grabbing the person's arm without any introduction. So that it was a very positive experience for all of us. But there have been other times where I know I haven't always reacted the best way in public situations, and I think we probably all have done that, or not acted appropriately. And sometimes, you just as Brian said, our emotions can get in the way. So I think it is very important to try to approach these situations in an objective way, and to remember that in all these types of situations, most of them, people have our best interests at heart, even if they are misguided, somewhat misguided on how to appropriately address them and what our best interests might be. So it's an opportunity for us to educate, and I think that's really important. We will talk a little bit more about different scenarios later, but I think there's one other type of advocacy that we haven't quite gone over yet, and we're going to have Rashad address it. Rashad, what are some other situations where we might be in where we would advocate?
All right. Well, you know what? There are a lot of different situations. And so, like Brian said, it's very important to be prepared when it comes to interacting in those professional situations. I can attest to having gone through something like that. And he's absolutely right about how the emotions can get in the way. And then how you end up having to really, you feel like you have to just do whatever they've said because you didn't know, going into the situation, what it would be like. And so you end up having to follow whatever they say without very much input. So that's one reason why it's very important to do that. And then as Rachel was talking about, in a public setting, that's always, we can all come up with 1,000,001 different times where things have gone right or where things have been like, what in the world just happened? But one thing that really is something that a lot of people may or may not think about, is that you even have to advocate sometimes amongst your family and your friends. And this can sometimes be some of the most challenging territory to navigate through, because these are the people who know you the best. They've known you the longest. So they've seen you at various levels of your life. And sometimes, in the case of family members particularly, they see you at a younger level. So they may not always value you as an adult, as a young adult, or wherever you currently are and what you're capable of. So it can be really easy for them to kind of trivialize what you are able to do and what you're capable of. So, and we're going to talk about this type of thing in specifics, in greater specifics, kind of as a review later. But I can think of several times where family members have played like video games and things like that, and I haven't been able to do that, because it wasn't accessible, or there hadn't been much thought. It just automatically had been assumed. But anyway, and these are people who generally want to include me, but there's the occasion where they're playing something, and it doesn't help too that I'm not very up on what's all out there, though I'm learning that there are games and things like that in ways that accessibility has been incorporated. But at the time, I didn't know. I mean, I just automatically assumed from what my brothers and other family members were doing that it just wasn't very accessible anymore. They're so involved at so many different levels to these games and stuff like that, as far as they become so much more sophisticated. So I just thought it was just out of my league, beyond my reach. So I would just sit there if there was a gathering or something like that, or if they're playing a card game or something like that. I would make mention of, the fact that there were Braille cards and things for certain things, but I just didn't know where to turn. So even in these situations, I was there, and I was able to enjoy myself somewhat. There was food and drink and snacks and things like that available. But, when you don't take the time to think about these things, then you can really be at a very big disadvantage. My family and I get together as much as we can. We find an excuse to get together and celebrate. But I think one Thanksgiving was when I really found out that they were willing to be accommodating. They were playing this game called Taboo, and it's one where it's a card, if you guys are familiar. For those of you who aren't, it's an awesome game. I love it. But it has a phrase or a word on it, and then below it, there's a line that separates that term from the terms that the person who's giving the hints and stuff cannot say when they're trying to get you to understand what it is, the rest of the people on the team. So I remember that it was so funny. It was perfect timing. I walked into the house, to my aunt's house, and they were trying to get the word daredevil, and they were talking about the guy in the movie and how, he moved around and did stuff really fast, or they talked about just different things. Maybe the guy couldn't see. It's safe to say I haven't watched the movie, but the point is they were throwing out clues, and I was like, oh my gosh, I know this one. And then after nobody on the team got it, since I was just a late comer to the game, I was like, I know what it is. It's Daredevil. And they were like, you could play this game. So it was instantly like one of those situations where me just being willing to participate and having that familiarity with my family, where it was really helpful. So it worked out. And then so every time we play a game, they often think about how they can include me, because we don't have stuff in Braille most of the time. It's just whichever game that my family member happens to bring with them. So, but they've been really good about it. But it's because, I was willing to say, hey, I wish I could play, or is there a way that we can make it work so that I can enjoy it too? Or asking that question. It may feel uncomfortable, or may feel like you're nagging, but the squeaky wheel gets the oil, or however that phrase goes. You have to really put yourself out there, even amongst your friends and your family members, to just say, I would love to be included, and here's what's worked for me in the past. So you being willing to present some possible solutions and things like that can really help you out. So that's really what I have on that one. And this really brings me to a great question that I want to get you guys to chime in on. How do y'all think you should advocate for yourself and the things that you need without putting anybody else out, without, alienating somebody or putting them on the defensive? What do y'all think about that?
Rachel, why don't you chime in first, and then I'll follow up after you. How do you feel about how to do this?
So I think it's important to remember that most of the time, it's just that they don't know. They just don't know how to include you or how to make those accommodations for you. So I think if you approach it with that mindset, from an objective mindset, and say, okay, I'm going to teach this person rather than just be aggressive and try to get my way. I think that really helps. So using those moments to educate. And I like Rashad's example of being able to jump in and just start doing. Sometimes you don't even need to say, this is how I'm going to do it. Sometimes you just need to do it. And I've had many situations where I've done that, you know, where you just jump in and do it. And yeah, I think that's my, I think that's really the main thing. And also don't take, you know, not taking certain things personally. Like in Brian's example, when, you know, he was talking about, you know, his meeting, you know, they are, if you're not getting the accommodations that you need for school, it's not a personal, it's not it's something personal to you. I mean, it is, you know, you, because you feel it like it is, but it's not, they're not sitting around saying, you know, I don't care about this person, we're not going to accommodate this person. Like, they're not doing that. It's just, they just don't know how to best help you. And so it's your job to teach them. So don't take things personally. Figure out solutions and have the solutions in your mind, how you're going to do it. And if someone asks you how you're going to do something and you don't know the answer, then tell them, I'm not sure yet, but I'm going to find out, and do your research, use your network, talk to your friends and your colleagues who have done these things before and who have, you know, anyway, that's
a really great, that is, you know, spot on, the best approach. I remember back shortly after that semester, maybe even the very next semester, I really gained a lot of knowledge from that meeting and that preparation and being able to advocate for myself. And so what I ended up doing was going kind of a step beyond that. And I said, hey, that seemed to work with all of those people and that professor. And maybe I can try to build what I call a working relationship with my professors. Maybe I don't even need to go up as high as that. And so what I started doing was I started attending office hours. I started sticking around after class. I started talking to the professors one-on-one. I started brainstorming with them. I looked at the syllabus ahead of time, and I would say, oh, look, we have this big project, and it seems to be a project that you can very well look at, I mean, in software engineering, and say, yeah, there's going to be a very heavy visual component of this. How am I supposed to do that? Well, instead of going into his office and throwing it on the ground and being like, you know what, you need to change this. This isn't right. I'm going to go to the ADA or something. I went in there and I said, hey, you know, Professor, I can see that we're going to have this big project coming up. And I'm just wondering, do you think it's possible for me to develop something similar, but without such a visual intensive component of it? And, you know, this is what I was thinking. Like you just said, Rachel, have done your research and really understand, like, prepare for what you're trying to do and develop that working relationship. And so I would go in there and say, hey, you know, I see this is going to be a part of it. What if I did it this way? You know, I was really thinking about, I can meet all of those requirements of this assignment by doing it this way. And then you start brainstorming with them, and then they get engaged and they say, look, he's not trying to skirt the system. He's trying to learn in his way. He's trying to do this the way that he can. And so that really helped. And I think probably the whole rest of my educational career, I pretty much handled most all of my accommodations directly with the professor. Because I had built working relationships with all of them every single semester. So that's big. And how do you meet with people without alienating them? I really think you hit it on the head, right? You just have to be willing to understand that they're not doing it in spite of you. They're not doing it to attack you. They're not doing it because they don't want to. They could just be doing what they're doing because they don't know. And you have to approach it in that way. Like, hey, are they really trying to do this against me, or do they not know? Maybe I need to teach them. Maybe I need to show them what is possible. And I say this and I mean it, and I say it all the time. It's one thing for you to be laughing with me. It's a different thing for you to be laughing at me. And in the same way, you got to approach these situations with that same kind of mindset, where are they trying to help me and they don't know how, or are they really not trying to help me at all? And so when you think about it in that way, you can approach it with a different mindset, like Rachel said.
If I could just, those are great points that both of you made, in terms of how to do this, because it can be tricky. I can personally say that I was somebody who it took a long time for me to get that I had to be organized enough to start advocating for myself in college myself, because I'd been so used to having it done for me prior to going into college. So making sure that I had those course registration numbers and the ISBNs for each book and emailing the professors. And I know this wasn't necessarily my area of expertise to cover earlier, but just in the general discussion, sometimes it takes people like me a while to get it through my head that if I don't want to go through it being my fault that something wasn't in place, then I've got to make sure that I do this. And so for me, I will say that there were times where I seriously and to this day question how much some of those professors were actually looking out for me.
Yeah.
As much as they were trying to cover their own skins. So unfortunately, you will run into that sometimes. It's not always the case. And so I recognize that now. But
that's very true.
Whether or not you think they're trying to help you or they're out to get you, you want to be prepared. You want to put your best foot forward so that even if they are trying to get you, they won't get you this time because you were prepared and you emailed them and you were able to copy everybody to the email so that they saw that you put forth the effort, you took the steps that you needed to take to get it done. So if they tried it, I'd be like, well, if you would refer back to my email that I sent on these dates, then you'll see where I made the effort. I did what was asked of me. And so it's at that point left to the university or the people to make it happen. It's not on your plate. But just in a broader sense, I just wanted to say that, I definitely felt what you were saying about being in a position of feeling like you're not in power because you don't have the things in place or you don't have anybody on your side.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's because they're trying to help you and you're not prepared. And sometimes it's because they don't really want to do it in the first place. So you'll run into both, definitely.
Let me just say that accountability part is critical. It is crucial. It is essential to anything. And it's not always a, refer back to my email because you're trying to throw it in their face. Sometimes it's just a good way of reminding even yourself, what did we talk about? Whenever, that is actually a really good thing you brought up, Rashad, is I remember when I started kind of advocating for myself and learning, one of the things that I learned early on was a paper trail goes a long way. So whenever I would have in-person meetings, I would leave that meeting and go directly to my computer and I would send an email. Hey, I just wanted to follow up on our meeting today. We talked about this. You said you were going to do this. I'm going to take care of these things and we're going to meet next week. Have a great day. Talk to you next week. And once that paper trail is laid, it's really an accountability piece. And I really like that you brought that up. So it's a really good strategy to follow up meetings like that, in-person meetings like that. And again, it's not always that you're going to throw it in their face later. It's also just a really good reminder for yourself as well as them to who's doing what and when is it going to be due by, because, you're not the only student they're working with. So it's important to keep that in mind. But real quickly, I wanted to throw another kind of question out there for us all to kind of tackle real quick. And I know, Rachel, that you had a kind of different view on this, and I think both views are important from, my view. So maybe we could talk about this, but when is it a good time to advocate for yourself, or when is it a good time to ask for help? And I think that key word there is asking for help. And so why don't you start off and talk about how you think of asking for help, and then I'll jump in and talk about it from my perspective.
So that's such a great question, because I feel like a lot of times when we think of being independent, we are, sometimes we think that independence means that we have to do everything on our own. So, we have to have all of our skills in place and everything is just, we don't need help from anybody. We can be islands, but people aren't islands. Interdependence, we are all interdependent on each other to some degree or other. And whether you're blind or sighted or whatever, that's just how it is as members of the human race. So there are times I think that, we may need to ask for help, and it's not, everybody's different. But for example, I'm thinking of it in terms of, I know, Brian, you're going to speak to the educational aspect in a minute, but in terms of just, okay, mobility as an example, a lot of us are at different levels when it comes to, how, being able to travel from point A to point B independently. So if I'm in an airport, my personal preference is to use Ira to get around, but there could be someone who maybe needs a little more hands-on help, and that is totally okay. So if you feel like there may be if someone feels like they want to be able to be more independent, they may need to ask for help to learn how to be independent traveling, and that's okay. I think that we're all at different levels, and when it comes to in a situation where, say, you're at a job interview and you're asked a question, how are you going to be able to do this job? Maybe you didn't prepare for that question, so it's best to have prepared for that question and to be able to answer that question. So hopefully you already know the answer to that, or have had ideas. But ideally, what you could do is you would maybe ask for help from someone who has done this job before. Use your network. We all have great networks. We're representing Learning Ally, and if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably either worked with a mentor or you've used some of the other resources with Learning Ally. There is a plethora of blind and visually impaired people who are who work with Learning Out, who work here, and also who are students. Being able to depend on each other in a way, that does not take away your independence, but it enriches it. It enhances your independence and enriches it. And I think that's when it's really absolutely okay to ask for help and to say, I don't know how to do this on my own right now, at least not yet, but I need help learning how to do it on my own.
Absolutely.
That's there's so many good points you just made right there. And but yeah, and I really agree, and I think that it's so important that we hear that perspective of getting help. When I think about getting help or asking for help, I tend to think about it in a more rigorous way, and both of them are applicable, and you need to know when you're in a situation for both. So the way that I look at getting help or asking for help is the situation I gave with my professors, and I was able to develop a working relationship with them, and then I didn't really have to go to the disability center or my DSO all the time. And I definitely didn't have to go to the director of the disability services, and I didn't have to go to the dean all the time. That is one ideal situation, right? Like, it's not always going to be like that, as Rashad pointed out. Sometimes you're going to be faced with adversity and they're not willing to budge. I'm sure one, if not all of us, have had that situation where the professor just wasn't willing to do anything. They wanted to teach the class, and they wanted to go. They did not want to take any time to work with you. They didn't want to take any time to make things accessible. And in that situation, what do you do? So when I think about asking for help, you need to know your chains of command. And as Rachel has pointed out many times, and I love it, is you have to understand where your network is and how to use them. So my professor, I would talk to them. Let's say they weren't willing to work with me. Okay, well then now I need to go to the disability center. I need to go ask the disability center, hey, such and such class has this going on. The professor isn't able or isn't willing to get it for me. I need to have the disability center convert this for me. Now, let's say, for example, the disability center is like, you know what? We don't have the time. We don't have the resources or the money to be able to convert that for you. Okay, well, that's not my problem. Now it's a bigger problem. So now I need to go ask the director of the disability center, hey, your DSO said that they weren't able to do this for me, that they didn't have enough funding. Oh, well, it's true. We don't have enough funding. well, guess what I got to do now? Now I have to go above their head. So really what I'm trying to get at here is sometimes asking for help is knowing who to involve next and how to do it, still navigating it along that line of being appropriate and effective. So if you go to the disability center, then to the advisor, the supervisor, and then possibly to the dean, eventually you're going to get what you need because you know the chain of command and how to ask for it appropriately.
So I think though it's also important. I think what you said was absolutely spot on. But I would, in that type of situation, you may have to. You may also need to take some of that responsibility on yourself if you, for example, so I had a situation that was similar to kind of what you described when I was in grad school, and I had a large book or part of a book that I needed to be transcribed, and I needed it by a certain date, and my DSO was not able to get it done, and I was doing exactly what Brian, what you were saying, but there wasn't time, because the date was coming, and I couldn't get it resolved. There was no way I would be able to get it resolved in the amount of time that I needed it to be resolved. So I had to ended up scanning it myself so that I could do the assignment. And now I could have asked for an extension, but I didn't. I wanted to get it done, and I knew that if I asked for an extension, I would end up being a lot more stressed later on. So for that particular situation, I had to find that balance of, it's their responsibility, but I still need to be responsible and get this done for this. And I still, of course, pursued it, and I still, wanted to make sure because I also had to think of the future. I didn't want this to happen to me again. I didn't want to have to spend a whole Saturday night scanning a book using Kurzweil, because that was a long night, and wasn't something I wanted to have to do again. But yeah, so I still had to, but I think finding that balance, and being able to find other ways around some of these barriers we may face is also very important. Okay, go ahead, Rashad.
I think that's a great thing. Before Rashad goes, I think that is a very, very key thing that neither of us really touched on. So I'm glad you brought that up, is that asking for help is one thing. Knowing when to ask for help is another thing, but understanding your chain of command is just as important as being effective and appropriate in it. But there's still one other component, and that component is, do I need to just, tie up my bootstraps and do this myself? That is amazing. And there's one thing that can be said for most all individuals who have a visual disability, and that is they are problem solvers. They are relentless. They are relentless, and they will make sure to find a way. I worked with a person just the other day on a software. He wanted me to do a user study for him. And he said, I've never seen people who have such a desire and such an aptitude to finding workarounds. I said, you know what? I never thought about that, but it's true. We find ways, and that is a very, very important thing.
Yes.
And don't lose that, but understand that it might take you a whole Saturday late night doing it yourself, but you'll get it done, versus it could take you a month or two to get it done the other way. Sometimes you need to buckle up your bootstraps. Other times you just need to know how to ask. So very, very good. Very important. Rashad, did you have something to add to this question topic?
Yeah. Really, what you guys have said, all of what you said is very important to remember to keep in mind. You guys covered everything. And just in thinking about how else a situation like that could be covered, pro tip, something that I've done several times, was since I was a music student, I went to the music library and had a music librarian help me when it came to having text and things like that scanned, because I didn't have the technology to do it on my own, and I didn't know how to do it. So it's working those networks, and I think we may have even covered that in another podcast episode, was about networking. But the thing is, being willing to reach out and actually taking the step of asking for help is so important, because sometimes you just need it. Sometimes you need help, and to me, there's no shame in asking for help. You put yourself back, you set yourself back when you're in need of something, and then you don't ask because you're trying to struggle and do it on your own, and you may not even be successful in certain situations. But I would just say a general rule of thumb is if it's something that is within your reach or your ability, then you should do it for yourself, because you get a greater sense of accomplishment when you do it that way. And then if there's something that you just cannot do on your own and there's no time and you need the help, then help is there, and you should not feel bad about asking for help if you've done all that you can, because you don't want to become that person that seems like they can't do anything by themselves. But by the same token, I think that we need to realize that even people who don't have disabilities need help sometime. I mean, I didn't build the townhouse that I live in, nor the shoes that I'm wearing. So we all have to have that sense of, like Rachel said, interdependence to a certain degree. So just knowing that and really being a willing participant in your education, both inside the classroom and outside, it's so important.
So the mentors have come up with some great situations we've all most likely been in or are heading for. We'd like to chat about a couple of them on this podcast, and we will definitely be revisiting this topic in the fall because, like it or not, advocacy is going to be, is always going to be a constant for us. So we're going to start with Brian with his first situation.
Nice. So let's talk about a situation that I think most all of us should or have already interacted with, and that is inaccessible handouts. How are we going to approach this? So here's the scenario. You receive an email from your professor, you open the file, and your screen reader just does not read it. It's a PDF and it is inaccessible. What do? Do you A, decide to ignore the email because your professor wasn't able to create an accessible handout? B, do you send a angry email to your DSO demanding that they transcribe it because your professor did not create it accessible to begin with? C, have your roommate read the document to you because your professor isn't responsible for accessibility. D, explain why you weren't able to do the assignment next time you have class. And I think I said assignment, but it's really assignment. So E, do you use technology to try to convert the file and send an email to your professor and DSO explaining the situation? So I'm going to ask you two to give me what you think. And if you need me to repeat any of these, definitely let me know. But how would you approach something like this where you have an inaccessible file?
Brian, I thought I was done with school and I wouldn't have to take any more quizzes. What is up with this? Just kidding. All right. So I think for me, what I would do, there are definitely different ways. I think it's important to realize that we all have choices in how we respond to these different scenarios, and those choices will come with varying results. So if I decided to ignore the email, what would happen? I mean, what do you guys think would happen? Would the problem go away? What would the professor think of me? Definitely not, right? So if I sent an angry email to my DSO demanding that the professor be educated about the accessibility, and I mean, that would probably not be it. It would probably get the job done, right? So could I do that?
You could do it. Should you? I don't think you should, though.
Should I? Probably not. Probably not. No, probably wouldn't give the best impression. I could have the roommate. I suppose I could have my roommate read the assignment to me. But and I could get it done. But then, do you think my roommate would want to do that every time I get an inaccessible assignment? Probably not. And I could be a victim and explain why poor me couldn't do the assignment. Probably wouldn't be a good idea either. So what I think would be the better solution, or at least the solution that would produce the best results, I can I can do, you'll make try to use my technology, or if there's time, get DSO to make this file accessible for me. And I would maybe go and talk to my professor or send an email to my professor and ask, ask if I could possibly have it in a different format next time. And, and that, or either that, if the professor refuses to help me, even after I've explained the situation, then I suppose I would have to, work out, with my DSO, how they can make things accessible for me.
Absolutely.
In future.
And I think that what I'm hearing is you're probably leaning towards E,
Yes.
in that you're going to try to take matters into your own hands. You're going to do what you can through assistive technology, trying to convert the file, and you're going to email simultaneously to your professor and the DSO to let them know about it, and hopefully they can get things rectified for the future. And that is the way. Although I do agree with you that it might be tempting to send that angry email. That's definitely not the appropriate or most effective way of handling this situation.
Right.
So,
I think that's true. You could be tempted, especially if you've faced something like this before, if it's from the same professor or something like that. But the thing is this too, a lot of times the people who work for the DSO, they know some of the professors and they know how some of them operate. So some of them are really good about accessibility and accommodations, and then some of them are not. So sometimes they're not unknown entities. So then they'll have something in place. So it's a good idea to follow up with that email, like Ryan said, between yourself, the professor, and the DSO, just so that you have that trail and just so that everybody's on the same page.
Yes. Having the records is very important. Having the paper trail, as Brian mentioned earlier.
So Rachel, what do you got for us?
All right. So I have service to humanity. All right. So scenario number 2. You hear that during the COVID-19 crisis, hospitals are short on blood. You have been responsibly social distancing for 2 weeks, and you've given blood before, so you should qualify again. But when you show up to the blood bank, a frazzled staff member sees your cane and says, I don't really know how I'm going to lead you to the different stations, so I'm sorry, you can't give blood today. I'll give you a participation sticker, though. So what would you do? Would you, A, take your sticker and leave, relieved that you can at least pretend you gave blood today? B, ask in a defiant tone to speak immediately to this person's manager, determined to show these unenlightened fools that blood is blood? C, leave because this is a crisis situation and they have enough to deal with. D, politely reply that you would very much like to give blood, explain that you can follow the staff members' directions without any physical contact with them, and ask if they have any additional concerns. What would y'all do?
I mean, it's something where you really have to be diplomatic about it and say, I don't understand why you're preventing me from doing this. This is something that I can do. I would explain to them, that blood is blood and, I'm healthy. I meet all of the requirements. So can you give me a reason as to why you don't want me to do this? Sometimes having them provide you an answer will help you. And then if that doesn't work, if they're being contrary about it, then you would need to escalate the situation and say, this is really not acceptable behavior. And, as a citizen or as a concerned volunteer, I'm going to have to speak to someone above you about this because
now the blood bank person has already said that they don't think that they should take you because they can't lead you to the stations without violating social distancing orders. So how would you respond to that if they said that to you?
Well, then hopefully you have a cane, or if you're a guide dog user, you have that. And so you could tell them, they could verbally give you cues as to which way to go as they lead you, something like that.
Cool.
That's just off the cuff what I'm thinking you could do.
Yeah. So you're going with D. Now, what if? Okay. So, and a follow-up question to either of you. What if? Okay, if you are, if you're comfortable taking verbal directions and following, then that is the solution. Now, what if though? What if you're not? What if you don't feel comfortable with that? How would you address that issue? What do you think you would do?
I don't know. This is a tough one.
That's a tough one. I think
especially during what we're getting into now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just gonna say, like what you said. I think that we'd be getting into deeper woods there, because we could argue that maybe the individual needs training. They should be proficient with a cane and able to take directions verbally or in any other way. I don't think that going in and expecting someone to give you human guide assistance is always the right choice. So in that situation, I would argue that maybe the individual should maybe just say, I'll come back with a family member and they can lead me around, or come up with a different situation, because it probably isn't fair for them to break social distancing rules on your behalf because you weren't trained. So that's kind of my thought.
I think that's an excellent thought. So you're basically saying that the person would ask for help from a family member, but maybe with the ultimate goal of eventually having the skills that they can navigate the blood bank or wherever on their own with verbal directions.
Absolutely.
Right. And because it did make me wonder how the person got there in the first place. True. So that might be one of the cases where, right. And if they took Uber, then they had to get into the building. Who knows? But I mean, this could happen. It certainly could. So,
and those, some of you who may have multiple disabilities, in addition to blindness, other disabilities, in addition to blindness, may need to think outside the box of other ways, maybe discussing with a family member or friend how you can navigate this type of situation, because it's not going to be the same for all of us. So I think trying to come up with productive, creative ways where you can still give this type of service right now during a crisis like this, and do it in a safe way. So let's go to our last situation with Rashad. Our last question.
All right. Well, here we go. This is something that most of us, or some of us at least, could really identify with. Friends from school or work are going to be meeting up on Zoom for a game night. Woohoo. But they did not invite you because they thought that you wouldn't have fun, because the game that they're going to be playing is inaccessible. You find out that they're going to be playing the game at the last minute. That definitely happens. So, do you yell, "You're violating the ADA, you'll be hearing from my lawyer"? Or do you sit quietly on the sidelines and hope that somebody recognizes that you're not having fun? Do you politely approach one of your friends or colleagues to see if you could talk about how to make it accessible for you? Or do you just not participate and sit at home and cry? What do you do?
Aww,
now, I'll start off by saying,
sad.
Personally, it is sad. It's sad. It's sad. It's so sad. Personally, I have done the second one. I will admit to have been someone who's just sat there and been like, maybe they'll notice. But that doesn't always work, because then sometimes what ended up happening with me was they realized that later on, and they said something about it later on, like, dang, we just left you out. Sorry. That happened with family one time. So, that's not always the best thing to do.
Yeah,
it's a pity party.
I admit that I've done that as well. I've done the last one before too, honestly. Well, maybe not stayed home and cried, but I've decided I wouldn't
probably
go.
sat home and moped, huh?
Felt sorry for myself. Yeah, moped about it, and not very productive.
No.
And I tend to be the outspoken one by nature. So I threaten them with my lawyer. No, I don't. But
yeah, I think that's a great solution. Let's do it.
You can get them to care about that. They might not care about your lawyer. So.
Yeah, I take the same approach that I take in other situations, but in a much different way. And sometimes humor goes a long way. So just being able to lighten the mood, or maybe they modify the game in some way, or maybe you pair up and you have somebody who is on your team.
That's usually what I end up doing with this sort of thing. Yeah,
and that's fun. That's fun.
It's okay.
That's
it's fun.
A bad thing.
It's totally fun. I think there's always ways, and if they're your friends, then they will be more than happy to make those accommodations, or maybe change, be willing, have someone pair up with you, and I think it's totally fair to ask, to ask how they can, talk to them about, discuss ways to make them Man, I'm stuttering all over the place, aren't I? It's really, I think it's totally okay to discuss ways to make them, to help the game be more to accommodate you.
For sure.
And it's fun. You can always have fun, and sense of humor is great. I love that, Brian, what you said about having a sense of humor.
Nice. Well, I think that this has been a great discussion. Thank you both for your insightful and your transparent experiences in both situations. I think we all had fun. I know I can speak for myself that I had fun doing it. And I just want to give a special thank you to Rachel for the beginning of this idea. She wrote a nice resource that you should all go check out. You can find that through the Schoology app, or you can go to lms.learningally.org, and you can find it on your dashboard in your courses in the Schoology app. And if you need any help, feel free to email csp@learningally.org. This is the end of our podcast pilot. We hope you enjoy it. We'll be back in the fall with more content, more drama, and more fun. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to tell your friends about our new adventure in creating a podcast.
Before we go, we'd just like to take the time to thank our Learning Ally staff for supporting the launch of this podcast, as well as all of our funders and stakeholders for supporting all that we do. The co-hosts for College Knowledge are Rachel Grider, Brian Duarte, and Rashad Jones. Our program director is Mary Alexander. Our podcast writer is Kristen Waitucky. Abigail Shaw produced the audio for this podcast. And our social media and distribution manager, Katie Atadjo. I'm Rashad Jones, and this is College Knowledge.